One thing that would have made fighting the Japanese, I think, so unpleasant would have been the places where you would have had to fight. In some of the islands of the South Pacific, especially on New Guinea, the temperatures were so hot, the climate so humid, that your clothes, even your boots, could rot right off your body, or fungus could grow easily on your body in that climate. New Guinea in particular had venomous snakes, deadly spiders, and numerous other things that could kill you even without having to think about the Japanese. On other places, the Japanese occupied remote volcanic islands, some of which had no natural sources of water, and many of which were incredibly dry. Soldiers reported feeling parched, suffering terrible sunburn. And of course, there was the isolation. Because in many places, American soldiers were fighting the Japanese on remote islands where there was no civilian population. Or if there was, it was made up either of Japanese or of people whom they had conquered some time before, and with whom Americans often felt they had very little in common. And of course, the Japanese were a different kind of opponent than the Germans. The Germans certainly were fierce fighters, fought very bravely, but they did follow, at least when dealing with the U.S. or the British, the rules of war as they were understood. The Japanese, however, often did not take prisoners. They believed that it was dishonorable to surrender, and so they would often kill people rather than accept their surrender. Or if they did accept their surrender, they often treated them brutally. In the Philippines, for example, on the Bataan Peninsula, around 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers surrendered. Of those, 10,000 were killed on a 60-mile Bataan death march, as prisoners of war forced to march to the nearest railroad junction might be killed, shot, or even beheaded if they stopped to get a drink of water, if they stumbled because they were tired, if they spoke or even looked at a Japanese soldier in a manner that Japanese soldier considered disrespectful. And then soldiers who did end up in prisoner of war camps had at least a 1 in 3 chance of dying in Japanese prisoner of war camps. And that means American or British or other prisoners of war. So the Japanese were a fierce foe to fight, which the United States did try to deal with by, when possible, avoiding conflict. After early fighting in the Solomon Islands and on New Guinea, where fighting did continue throughout the war, the U.S. adopted a policy of island hopping, of trying, when possible, to bypass enemy bases we did not absolutely have to capture, and in cutting off their supply lines with the power of the U.S. Navy, especially our submarines. The Japanese not having enough fuel to mount the kind of patrols they needed to protect their supply ships. And that way we hoped we could bypass and starve bases we did not need to attack immediately. For example, we were able to avoid the heavily defended base of Rabaul. We never attacked the heavily fortified island of Formosa, now known as Taiwan, an island with a very interesting history in its own right. Instead, seizing just the islands we needed to use as a base to move on to the next truly vital islands. But even this was incredibly hard going. In the Mariana Islands, for example, which we needed to capture to set up a bombing base from which we could hit the Japanese islands directly, we encountered for the first time Japanese civilians, the Japanese having controlled the Marianas for several decades. And just as Japanese soldiers would fight to the death, civilians on Saipan fought to the death as well, or rather committed suicide rather than be captured, for fear that we would treat them as badly as, they treated the people they captured. On the north end of the island of Saipan in the Marianas, there are high cliffs, and Japanese civilians would leap off the cliffs to their death in the water below. Mothers would throw their children off and jump after them, or leap off the cliffs with their babies in their arms, plunging to their death rather than be captured. Indeed, there were so many dead bodies floating off the coast of Saipan that the Navy had trouble navigating the waters around the island. And from there, if possible, things got worse. When the United States finally returned to the Philippines, where Douglas MacArthur waded ashore, to a waiting camera crew to whom he could announce, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The United States faced 80,000 Japanese soldiers whom we fought from October of 1944, for the most part until the end of the war in August of 1945, although one Japanese soldier in the Philippines did not surrender until 1974, 30 years after being told by his commanding officer to cause trouble and they would be back for him later. He had not surrendered until they found his old commander and brought him back to the Philippines, where he'd been waging war against local police and farmers, killing police, raiding farms, and otherwise causing trouble, unwilling to believe the war was over. In the fighting around the Philippines, the U.S. Navy first encountered the Kamikaze, the suicide bomber, taking its name from the typhoon or divine wind, which had saved the Japanese from an invasion by the Mongols in the 1200s. And now the Japanese used the term at least, kamikaze, or wind of the gods, to refer to a defense of their home islands against a new invader. And while fighting in the Philippines, we went further. In February of 1945, the U.S. Marines landed on Iwo Jima. It took 100,000 Marines a month to defeat 25,000 Japanese, only a couple hundred of whom actually surrendered. The rest fought to the death. The Marines got more medals of honor in that 1 month than have been awarded for any other campaign in American history. In April of 1945, U.S. forces prepared to invade Okinawa, the last major target before moving into the Japanese home islands themselves. For the attack on Okinawa, we gathered around 1,300 warships, 180,000 combat troops, almost twice as many men as went into battle on D-Day at Normandy. And it took until June to capture the island. American forces faced over 2,000 kamikaze attacks during that time. Kamikaze, of course, were a tactic born of desperation by the Japanese, running low on supplies. They did not have to build a very good plane. They only had to fuel it up for a one-way trip, and the pilots did not require much training. And for a society willing to die, eager to die, to defend their emperor and their home, it made sense in a way that it did not for Americans or other allied powers, dealing not just a physical blow, but a psychological blow to Americans who saw planes plunging to their doom in the decks of American ships. And from Okinawa, the home islands would be next. And this was a terrifying prospect. After all, the Japanese had fought to the death for tiny volcanic rocks, with no civilian population whatsoever. There is no way to know how they would fight to defend their home islands, although surely ferociously. Japanese women and children were sharpening bamboo stakes and hardening the spear tips in fires to make bamboo spears to fight with. The United States began making plans for an unprecedented invasion force. Douglas MacArthur was to be promoted to a 6-star general, a rank that had never officially been awarded before, although the Army has since decided that Black Jack Pershing, as commander of the American Expeditionary Force in World War I, counts as a 6-star general, and so of course George Washington has been posthumously promoted to that rank as well. Estimates for the casualties America might suffer ranged from 125,000 up to 1 million or more in just the first few months of an invasion of Japan. Of course, in the U.S. military, if you're wounded while in combat or a combat zone, you receive the Purple Heart. We produced 500,000 of them in preparation for the invasion of Japan. The United States is still using that stockpile of Purple Hearts. Over the course of wars in Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, the United States has not in 75 years suffered as many casualties as we feared we might lose in the first few months of an invasion of Japan. Indeed, of those 500,000 medals we produced in 1945, around 120,000 are still left. Because, of course, we had an alternative. The United States had been working since nearly the beginning of the war, in most careful secret, on a plan called the Manhattan Project, an atomic bomb. The early research had been done at the University of Chicago, where they had proven they could begin a nuclear reaction. From there, it was necessary to refine nuclear material to use as fuel for the bombs. Uranium was refined in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, chosen in part for secrecy. It would be hard for Nazi spies to get from the coast all the way to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Likewise, it was assumed that anyone looking for the most advanced cutting-edge technology or research in nuclear physics would probably not look to Anderson County, Tennessee as their first or even second choice. And of course, it requires a lot of electricity to refine uranium, and in Tennessee, electricity was cheap thanks to the TVA. Plutonium was refined in Hanford, Washington, another location viewed as fairly remote and with access to cheap hydroelectricity as well. From there, the bombs were assembled in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and tested not far away in Alamogordo, New Mexico, the logic being if things went wrong, nobody would miss New Mexico, which was an actual concern. Some scientists feared that once an uncontrolled nuclear reaction began, it wouldn't stop, that atom after atom after atom might split into its component parts and keep going, burning off the entire atmosphere of the Earth and all life on the surface of the Earth as we know it. Others hoped the destruction might be more localized. Indeed, some even made bets whether it would destroy all of creation or just New Mexico, although how the winner would have collected, I'm not certain. Still, these were scientists, and there's only one way to find out, which is to test it. So the atomic bomb, or Trinity, test was conducted in New Mexico in the summer of 1945, completely vaporizing the tower on which the gadget, as they called it, was tested, turning the sand around it into glass. Many of the scientists never even got to see the test, as they were in concrete bunkers or wearing glasses so thick to protect their eyes from radiation they could not actually see the blast. The man who claims to have seen it from closest was the physicist Richard Feynman, the funniest nuclear physicist I'm aware of, although there's not much competition, I think, who, being a genius, calculated what kind of radiation would actually reach the point he was standing at, and decided that a sheet of glass would be enough to stop the radiation. So he took off his dark glasses, jumped in a truck, shut the door, and watched the blast through the windshield. So he claims to be the only person to have actually seen a Trinity blast. Of course, he died, but over 40 years later, so I suppose the odds were not too bad. Having this bomb, the question, of course, was, do we actually use such a destructive device? But the man who would make this decision would not be the man who had guided the United States through the Great Depression or through the Second World War, because shortly after winning an unprecedented fourth presidential election, Franklin Roosevelt had died in April of 1945 of a brain hemorrhage while on vacation at Warm Springs, Georgia. His last known words being, "I have a terrible headache." And so he was followed by his third vice president, the last American president not to have graduated from college, Harry Truman. And it would be this man who would decide whether to use the most advanced technology known to man at the time. Although, to be fair to Truman, while he may not have graduated from college, he was actually a speed reader. He read often and deeply, and was actually quite knowledgeable. And he made his decision based on the advice of military and scientific experts, although a number of the scientists involved in building the bomb actually recommended not using it because it was so destructive. But of course, Truman finally decided to use the bomb. Indeed, he always said there was really not that much difficulty in deciding. And for Truman, there were three reasons. First, to end the war quickly and save American lives. After all, estimates ranged from well over 100,000 to over 1 million casualties in the initial invasion of Japan, Certainly our experience fighting the Japanese elsewhere had shown they were willing to fight to the death. Second, we wanted to end the war quickly before the Russians could get involved. The Soviet Union and Japan had maintained neutrality since 1939. The entire time that World War II was taking place and the United States was fighting both the Germans and the Japanese, the Soviets were only fighting the Germans. But they had promised to go to war with Japan 3 months after Germany surrendered, and that time was coming soon. And while at one point we had looked forward to having their help, by now we were sharing Europe with the Soviets, and did not look forward to sharing Japan with them as well. And so there was some desire to end the war before the Soviet Union could occupy part of Japan. And third, we wanted to see what this thing could do. And while many scientists did not want to use the bomb, some certainly did, and so did some military strategists. Indeed, knowing that such a bomb was being developed, a few Japanese cities had been spared the firebombing and had destroyed most of them over the course of the war. So there could be a good before and after picture of what a city looked like before and after being hit by a nuclear bomb, but otherwise largely untouched by war. And so the decision was made to drop the uranium bomb, or Little Boy, on Hiroshima, Japan in August of 1945. The initial blast killed about 75 or 80,000 people. More died later of radiation poisoning or various types of cancer. And much of the city was obliterated. The United States warned the Japanese that we had more of these and they'd better surrender, but they did not. So, 3 days later, we dropped the plutonium bomb, or Fat Man, on Nagasaki, which killed about 40,000 people or so on the spot. Again, more dying later of radiation, poisoning, or different types of cancer. And so from this we can see that the bomb made using nuclear material refined in Tennessee was more deadly than that